Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize. It looks like my screen is taking a moment. There we are. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jackie Schildkraut. I'm the Executive Director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. I'm joined today by our guest, Bryce Hruska, from Syracuse University, and Margaret Formica from SUNY Upstate to talk about why place matters, specifically how neighborhood patterns can shape gun violence. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us, Jackie.
Of
Yeah,
course.
thank you for having us.
I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation, and I know you guys have been doing a lot of really important work. So I want to kind of dive right in and set the scene a little bit for our audience. Thank you guys so much for joining. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes for our audience before we get started. There is an opportunity at the bottom if you have any questions for Q&A that you can drop those into the chat, and we will work them into the conversation. Additionally, today's session is being recorded, so that way we will be able to have playback available for yourself or for any colleagues you might be interested in sharing. And of course, please feel free to drop any other questions, not necessarily pertaining to the material, into the chat as well. So Margaret and Bryce, I want to kind of kick this off by asking you, your work's really been focusing on place as a factor for gun violence. What was your reason for choosing this angle? And can you tell us a little bit of background about your work?
Sure. Bryce, do you want me to kick it off and then I'll pass it to you?
Sounds good. Go for it.
All right. So just a little quick background on me. I'm Margaret Formica. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at SUNY Upstate Medical University, and I'm an epidemiologist by training. So I originally got into gun violence research about 10 years ago, and then that was at the request of leadership here at Upstate at the time, who was trying to get more information around the problem of gun violence in the city of Syracuse, because it was pretty clear that we had a gun violence issue here in Syracuse. No one was working in this area in my department, or really at Upstate in general, so I kind of jumped into it. I was brand new to this area of research. I knew absolutely nothing about it at all. So I started by looking at the literature, and I quickly found that neighborhood poverty was very strongly associated with gun violence. Poverty is also an issue here in Syracuse. We have one of the highest child poverty rates in the country. So my first project was to really examine the descriptive epidemiology of gun violence in Syracuse. So for those that aren't familiar with epidemiology, that's basically who is affected by gun violence, where is it occurring, and how is it changing over time. So as part of that work, I created a map of the shooting incidents with injuries by census tract in the city of Syracuse, and I overlaid it with census tract poverty levels. And for the most part, not surprisingly, they aligned very well. The census tracts with really high levels of gun violence were also highly impoverished. But what really stood out to me were, in this map, were these pockets of areas or neighborhoods that had very high poverty levels, but low levels of gun violence. And that really sort of piqued my interest in the impact of place on gun violence. There were these neighborhoods in Syracuse that were highly impoverished, surrounded by areas that had high levels of gun violence, and yet they seemed to be protected from that gun violence. And so I was really interested in how that could be playing a role and what issues of place could be playing a role. It was shortly after that that Bryce and I connected and really began our collaborative work around place as a potential factor associated with gun violence.
Go ahead, Bryce.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So my interest in place and in gun violence in Syracuse also started about a decade ago. So I am in a public health department. I'm a professor of public health, but my background is actually in psychology, and my broader program of research is really focused on the mental health consequences of traumatic life events, including gun violence. And about a decade ago, the kind of research I was doing was more focused on trying to understand person level factors that impact whether someone experiences negative mental health consequences after they have an injury, like a car accident or experiencing community violence. And in that research, we would oftentimes meet up with people and we were asking them questions about how they were coping, their social support mechanisms, all things that were really focused on person level features, reactions that the person was having to the event. And we would meet with them at various points in time. And oftentimes we would drive to their homes, we would pick up surveys and we would kind of see the surroundings where they were. And in the course of talking to people, just anecdotally, they would say things like, I've had a really hard time recovering from this injury. While I was in the hospital, someone broke into my house. Or, now that I'm back, I don't have a lot of support from the community and from my neighbors, don't know them very well. So I'm really struggling. And so that really set me thinking about the importance that context may have for recovery and how people may recover from an injury, when they return to the community after they leave the hospital. And I stayed on that line of thinking, but I didn't do anything with it for a while. But it was something I was always thinking about. And probably right before Margaret and I started talking, we did this big study where we were looking to see, could we connect some community level features to people's mental health? So people who had experienced some kind of traumatic event, often it was interpersonal violence that included gun injury. If we could kind of capture features of their neighborhood, the place that they were returning to after they returned to the hospital, did that predict how they did 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months down the road? And what we found is that it made a big difference. It really could help to account for whether someone recovers or not. And so as a psychologist, oftentimes that field is more focused on people and person level factors, and the appreciation for those place-based features in those contexts, it's just not a level of analysis that people are really focusing on. So that really stood out to me, and it got me thinking about, it seems like a missing piece in this puzzle is taking a step back and looking at the upstream community level factors that shape, whether someone even experiences an event like gun violence. And so that was around the time that Margaret and I started talking. We connected and started talking about some of the research that she had been doing, and how Syracuse might be an interesting place, an interesting geographical setting to do a study examining place features as they relate to gun violence.
And it's interesting because obviously I'm familiar with both of your campuses and where they're located, and we're seeing Syracuse as a city right now undergoing a lot of structural change regarding place and what that looks like, which I think you guys have touched upon in your work with the new I-81 project. Can you talk a little bit about that, sort of what we're seeing that doing to this idea of place and whether or not we think that that might impact gun violence in the community?
Sure. Margaret, do you want to start? Should I start off?
You can go ahead and start this one.
Sure. You guys are the most cordial guests.
So we, as you were mentioning, Jackie, so for years now, we've been hearing about the I-81 project and the potential impact it could have on infrastructure. And one of the reasons why we got interested in Syracuse as a place is that I-81 has divided the city for 70 plus years now. And Syracuse is not unique in that. There are many cities, particularly the Northeast, where highways or railroads or other infrastructure pieces were built in a way that divided residents, often led to disinvestment in areas near the highway or the railroad. And so over time, you would see a concentration of vacant homes, or you would see underinvestment in surrounding infrastructure and grocery stores, and all the things that we know people need to be healthy. And you were mentioning what's happening. So with the next year or so is really where we're starting to dismantle the highway that runs through the city and replace it with this community grid, where we're going to be seeing changes in how people move in and through the city. There's going to be changes to the way different neighborhoods are structured and what they have access to. And so it really represents an opportunity to try to implement changes, kind of capitalize on this natural intervention that's occurring to create places that may promote health for everyone and decrease some of the reasons that gun violence has been a problem in certain parts of the city.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, as Bryce mentioned, when 81 went up, I think the project started in the late 1950s and continued through the 1960s. It really was very, very devastating to the communities, both that were directly impacted by it, but also surrounding the neighborhood surrounding it. And I think with the current project, with the 81 coming down and the community grid coming into play, I think there are a lot of hopes and plans to revitalize some of those downtown neighborhoods. So I see this really as an incredible opportunity for urban planning with the specific intention of decreasing gun violence. And I'm not sure that that's something that's really been done before, at least not on this scale. But I think it also means that there's quite a sense of urgency around it, right? Because this is a natural experiment that's happening right now. So there are a lot of things that I think we need to keep considering and thinking about as we're moving forward with our research. Thinking about, for example, some of the place-based factors that we haven't examined yet. And could those things increase or decrease gun violence? How do we make sure that the people that are driving the redevelopment in these neighborhoods are actually considering the impact of their design on gun violence specifically? How do we ensure that the people who live and work in these communities have a voice in all of this change? And then I think with my sort of epidemiology hat, my researcher hat, I'm thinking a lot about, how can we accurately measure all of this change? Because that's going to be very difficult. And I don't know that we really have an answer to that yet.
So what are some of the preliminary questions, as this project is starting in real time? If anybody on the call has actually driven through Syracuse, you can see I-81 every 3 feet. There's another notification on your Waze app that there's construction. What are some of the, initial questions that you're thinking about? And then have you given thought to how those questions might change as the project continues to develop and change?
So I think one thing I'll mention is, some of the work that we've been doing, the last couple of years, the project that Margaret and I've been working on. So we've been focusing on data from 2020 to 2022 or so. We've got some older data too, but we've really been focusing on these first few years before these substantial changes take place within the city. And so we have a good baseline for how the city was functioning and how place-based features impact gun violence within the city. And maybe now's a good time to mention some of the things that we found. So what we did was, there's all kinds of different place-based features that could be important, and they often get cited in the gun violence literature. Things like street lighting, alcohol outlets. There's all kinds of things. We were trying to pick a small set of factors that maybe are consistently related to gun violence, and that there is a fairly large body of research showing that there's some kind of connection. And so we narrowed it down to about 4 different things that we thought were going to be important for trying to understand gun violence in Syracuse. And those 4 features were looking at residential segregation, and so division between the number of Black and white residents in neighborhoods within the city. We looked at vacant properties within the city. We looked at neighborhood walkability, so how easy it was to pass through a neighborhood, how accessible it was, how permeable a neighborhood is. And then we also looked at green space access, specifically access to public parks. And that was an important one, potentially because public parks serve different functions. They provide a place for people to gather. They provide they can be a source of kind of informal surveillance, so that can decrease, crime that occurs or gun violence that occurs. And so we looked at these 4 different things, and we did something a little bit different than is often done when people are examining these place-based features. We decided we wanted to see if there were certain types of neighborhoods in Syracuse. So in other words, are there different ways that these 4 different features combine, almost like different recipes? Like, are there different kinds of neighborhoods that vary in terms of these different features? And then in turn, are those types of neighborhoods maybe differentially related to gun violence? And so we kind of do this in 2 steps. So the first thing we did is we looked to see, are there these different types of neighborhoods? And there are. We found that there's 4 different types in Syracuse that vary in meaningful ways on these different place-based features. There was kind of 2 profiles or 2 types of neighborhoods that were not especially relevant to gun violence, but they exist in the city and they have levels of place-based features that differ from the other 2. And then there were two profiles that were especially notable because of their relationship to gun violence. And so those two profiles, what they kind of shared in common was they were both places where there was a lot of segregation between Black and white residents. And there was also a lot of physical degradation in the form of vacant properties. But the degree to which there was vacant properties varied. So in one of them, there was about 5 to 6 vacant houses per block, and the other there was more like 12. So like a lot of vacant properties combined with residential segregation. And these two different places also varied a bit on green space and walkability. So in terms of green space, they were kind of comparable. Maybe one had a little bit more access than the other, and that one was much more walkable than the other. So it was easier to get through those neighborhoods and to get to them and to pass through them. Okay, so those two are especially relevant to gun violence. And we looked at gun violence in two different ways. So we looked at the number of gun injuries and fatalities that were anchored to a particular place. So like where was gun violence happening? In which neighborhoods was it occurring? But then we also looked at where gun violence victims were living. So we could both know, is gun violence happening in this neighborhood? And are the people who are living there the ones that are being impacted? So we had two different outcomes that we were able to look at. And that really was interesting because we could compare these different neighborhood types to one another. And then we could also look within each one and see, do they differ from one another on these two different outcomes, which could tell something about the nature of gun violence in each of these places. So what we found was that one of those two profiles that I mentioned made up like 5-6% of the city. And the number of event-based casualties and residence-based casualties were really much larger in those places. And that's kind of consistent with the literature, where we have a small number of neighborhoods that disproportionately experience the burden of gun violence. And so in those neighborhoods, there's both a lot of gun casualties occurring there, and the residents are experiencing it, okay? And then the other profile is a bit more interesting in some ways, because it also had high levels of gun violence occurring there, but there was more gun violence occurring there than could be accounted for by the number of people who are experiencing violence. And so what that suggests is that in those neighborhoods, non-residents are being exposed to gun injuries and gun casualties, something that wasn't happening in the other type of neighborhood. So we have a different type of pattern, a different type of exposure happening, which is interesting, because then the question becomes, what is it about those neighborhoods that might be drawing non-residents in, or might be causing them to be disproportionately impacted by gun violence within the city? And so there's a number of reasons that there could be. So we know that gang activity is a major driver of gun violence within the city. We also know that, I was mentioning there's more walkability in those neighborhoods, more connectivity, easy to get to them. So maybe there's more transit stops there. Maybe there are more bus stops kind of capitalizing on the accessibility of those places. And so there's a greater kind of interchange between residents and non-residents, more opportunities for gun violence to occur. There may also be, other commercial establishments that draw non-residents into these places. We know that places like bars or restaurants, gas stations, grocery stores, these are all places of commerce that can draw people in, and oftentimes those places also place people at risk for gun violence. And so those types of places could, in those neighborhoods that have a lot of physical degradation, they're accessible, there's a lot of segregation, look at those combinations of things could place non-residents at risk, more so than in the other neighborhood where there's a lot happening, but it's happening more to residents more so than to non-residents. So that's what we found. And getting back to the question you asked, Jackie, what might be happening in the years to come. So this is kind of our baseline data, what we're thinking of as, what's going on in Syracuse before any of these changes are occurring within the city itself. And so moving forward, I think starting this year, actually, they're going to start dismantling the highway, and we're going to start to see, the city change in the way it's made up, and the way these different neighborhoods are made up with regard to these features that we've examined. And so, I think what could happen potentially is that some of these things we've examined change, hopefully in a positive direction, and we have more resources, more opportunities for people and kind of decreasing some of those other risk factors that could make these neighborhoods decrease firearm violence, overall, and then also decrease risk for non-residents in particular in one of those neighborhoods that I was just mentioning.
This came in from one of our attendees, and I don't know if you can answer this specifically or if you can maybe offer a general area within the city where this may be more likely to happen. Are there specific neighborhoods that you can mention where you're seeing these differences? And if so, either way, I guess, where are they relative to the highway in a way that they may be impacted?
It's a great question. And so one thing we haven't done, but I've thought about doing it for the meetings that we do with community organizations, is to take, there are certain, I should back up and say, like the way we examine neighborhoods, we looked at census blocks, which are, geographical areas that are defined by the U.S. Census Bureau to facilitate collecting census data every decade or so. And so that's how we define neighborhood. Now in Syracuse, we do have certain areas that we recognize as neighborhoods, and they don't necessarily fit, exactly over those different divisions that the Census Bureau sets up. So we can do that. We haven't done it yet, but we could see how kind of the known neighborhoods overlap with these different profiles we found, but we haven't done that yet. But what I can say is that the neighborhoods that we're finding that were at risk for gun violence, they tended to concentrate in two different places. So they were to the west of 81, kind of the middle of the city, but to the west of 81, and then the north of 690. Those are the two predominant places. And they often shared borders, which is kind of interesting, actually, because you have a different gun violence pattern, and yet they're occupying a similar geographical space. But what's inside those spaces is different, as I was mentioning, like the different place-based features are different. So that makes them more interesting in my mind, because even though they're close together, they tend to be next to one another. There's enough differences within them that it seems to be causing a different pattern in the way that people are experiencing gun violence in those places.
Margaret, anything to add?
Sorry, I had to mute because I had some construction going on directly outside of my office.
Because you're near 81?
Yes, probably. Actually, I think this is construction on the building, our building itself. But yeah, I think what Bryce was talking about with the neighborhoods. It's interesting that the gun violence, the increased levels of gun violence, was actually the same. Those 10 years ago that I started to look at this data, we saw those higher levels in those same areas, which is the north of 690 and kind of west of the city. And I do think that some of those neighborhoods are going to be directly impacted by the changes that occur with 81. There's no question about it. And so I think figuring out really, again, how to measure and bring in some of the other aspects that are going to be affecting potentially gun violence in these communities as well. There's going to be displacement that occurs for some of the residents because they're right near 81 or right near some of those interchanges that are happening even with 690, and what it will be the impact of that. So I think there's kind of a lot of things in the mix that we're going to be seeing going forward with these changes.
We've been getting in some amazing questions from our audience. Please all feel free to use that Q&A and keep them coming that I'm going to pose to you. But I did actually just have one question, because you mentioned that the data that you guys collected for your baseline is from 2020 to 2022, which we also know was the period where COVID was at its highest, which not only, of course, changes the place aspect of it, but also sort of the routine activities of the residents, right? So I guess, do you have any concerns, or how are you thinking about, the fact that people were working at home and kids were going to school at home, which can also change the patterns of gun violence? Are you looking at sort of that in-between period as well, post-COVID / pre-destruction of 81? Are you looking before COVID? How are you thinking about that?
It's a great question, and it's a valid concern because, as you just mentioned, right, it was really just a different time in the country and in Syracuse and across cities across the U.S. So we had data going all the way back to 2010 and going up to 2022. And our original intent actually was to look across the fuller scope of that time window, because we thought that that would kind of help address these problems. And so what we found, though, was that the data, so we used a lot of data that was administrative data. The city does a great job on their open data portal of making a lot of these things available to the public. But that's something that's evolved across time. That's something that wasn't as well developed in 2010, So the data that went farther back in time, it was more questionable in terms of whether we were measuring the thing we thought we were measuring, or just some of the quality, I think, control measures that were taken weren't quite implemented yet. That being said, we did do the latent profile analysis using that larger window, and we got the 4 profiles more or less that we got in the 2020 to 2022. So it seems like there is something inherent to the way the city is structured. I think that there's been a lot of efforts to change some of those features. Vacant housing comes to mind, and trying to address that within the city. And there's been, I think, some good gains in that direction. But I think ultimately the neighborhoods that affected have been the same ones across that full time period. And so even though things were disrupted during COVID, that signal is still coming through in the analyses that we did. So I guess the take-home message is that there does seem to be a similar patterning of these place-based features, regardless of the time period that you look at. So even if you kind of collapse across a much wider period of time, we seem to be seeing something similar to what we got just in that narrow window around 2020 to 2022. For that reason, we've also been opting with that more narrow window because the data seem to be more polished, if you will, or they seem to be maybe a little more cleaner, or at least there's more documentation that we can be sure that we are looking at what we think we're looking at.
So you guys actually mentioned this, and it sparked some good questions. So I'm actually going to put 2 questions together in one. How do you, in terms of, obviously you guys are having meetings with stakeholders and talking with, city officials and other, vested groups in this project. How do you improve these neighborhoods without risking gentrification, especially in terms of safety and violence? And because we know that these more urban projects tend to also lead to displacement, what is going to be done for those who are displaced? And is there any concern about displacing crime rates and gun violence along with them?
You want to say anything,
Margaret? Start this one if you want. I was just going to say that I think engaging the community members right from the beginning as we move forward with these additional projects is going to be key. We have been having these stakeholder meetings. We've begun communicating with our findings from this particular project with the community stakeholders, and we're definitely learning from them. But I think, making sure that they're included is going to be really important, and making sure that all of the government officials, again, the people that are kind of making the decisions about what's going to be happening moving forward, they have to be at the table also. And I think it's a lot of chefs in the kitchen. So figuring that out is tough.
Yeah, let me just add and kind of echo some things that Margaret said that I think are kind of worth highlighting and underscoring. So I think that as Margaret was just saying, there's a lot happening. It's a big project. There are many people involved, many organizations, many departments. There's city officials, there's the state. There's a lot of people who are trying to coordinate this project. And I think when we talk to community-based organizations, some are expressing the sense that maybe that the residents are not being engaged with in a way that's meaningful, or if it's happening, it's not something that they're aware of. And that could simply be because there's a lot happening and it's hard to keep track of all the things that are occurring. But I think that there's maybe a sense there among organizations that are they're community facing, they're talking to people. There's a sense that there maybe is not as much engagement there as the project unrolls, you know what I mean, as it moves forward. And so I think one thing that we thought of that we think is really important is as this project moves forward, there's a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate that this massive infrastructure project can have a tremendous benefit for the people who live there. And there are cities across the United States that are facing similar decisions about what to do with aging infrastructure. Do you replace it? Just kind of keep it the same? There's a lot of opportunity there. It's impossible to really understand the impacts that something like this will have. It's like no one can fully predict what will happen as all of these neighborhoods change. But what we can do is implement processes where we are engaging residents and talking to them and surveying them and hearing about how this project is impacting them so that we can intervene before these problems occur down the road. So I think maybe that's the single most actionable thing that we can do is just making sure that we are talking to people before larger problems manifest, and to try to ensure that the best possible outcome comes from this project that's taking place.
We have several additional questions. I'm going to kind of work our way through them. Have you guys considered the relationship between neighborhood school quality and neighborhood gun violence? And if so, this is also a question I'm very interested in as somebody who spent 5 years in the school district there. What did you find?
It's a great question. We haven't looked at schools in particular yet. I think it's a future direction for us. I think that there are other folks who are doing work in this space at Upstate and at SU. And so I can speak to some of the research that I know that's been done focusing on this. And what it seems to suggest is that, schools that are in neighborhoods where there's a lot of gun violence, in Syracuse specifically, we can see that there's a connection between how much gun violence is occurring and the way students are, how they're doing in school. And most of those outcomes are focused on kind of academic outcomes, but you can imagine how socio-emotional outcomes are probably similarly impacted. So we have not applied those findings to our study yet. That's a future direction. I think it's worth doing and trying to understand how proximity, school districts and their proximity to these neighborhoods, how that may impact, or just kind of understanding where they fit into the whole equation, actually, because that's also a potential intervention point.
Yeah, what's interesting, oh, no, Margaret, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, to sort of piggyback off what Bryce was talking about, that, again, we've primarily focused on those physical aspects of place up to this point. But I think, moving forward, we definitely will try to incorporate some of those more social aspects of place, things like connectedness in the neighborhood, but obviously school quality, things like that. All those social aspects that are obviously important too.
And one of the things that we also know is that oftentimes when we think about gun violence in schools, especially in these more urban areas, it tends to be spillover effects from the community into the schools, or obviously bringing weapons for protection because you have to maybe not be unsafe at school, but your commute to and from school could be dangerous as well. So certainly a very fruitful opportunity to consider. We can chat later about what we found with exposure to violence in schools. We've got a couple additional comments. One was that one of our audience members sees some overlap here with Unforgiving Places by Jens Ludwig, which was focused more on Chicago, not on Syracuse. But are there any points that you would distinguish your findings from these Unforgiving Places model, if that's something you're familiar with?
I'm not familiar intimately with that model. Margaret, do you have any?
I'm not either.
Well, so now our audience member has given you guys homework. So come back and we'll find out the answer for you. A follow-up from that same audience member that they were interested in, they understand that the relevance of place-based environment features could an additional factor be longstanding feuds between families living in the neighborhoods or any sort of ongoing conflicts? Can that also kind of impact or correlate with space?
Do you want me to jump in on this one first? Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that, just from my working in this space for about 10 years, but then more recently, the meetings that we've been having with community stakeholders, is that the gun violence, the urban gun violence that we see here in Syracuse is not necessarily, we know that there are gang issues everywhere. But the issues that are occurring here in Syracuse aren't necessarily similar to the very well organized gang territories that we see in other cities. We have these like loose neighborhood disputes, but what we've learned over time is that yes, these are long-standing family or neighborhood disputes that have been going on for generations, and they have been driving a lot of this urban gun violence. And so, again, I think that's another aspect that at some point, in terms of the social aspects of place, we'll need to incorporate in our research going forward.
Speaking of your research, we have a budding independent violence prevention researcher in the audience who is curious about what sort of spatial analysis tools you guys have been using.
Sure. So to identify the neighborhood profiles, we use something called latent profile analysis, which, you take a set of variables. So in our case, it was those four I mentioned, and you test competing models against one another to see, what seems to fit the city of Syracuse best. Is it one profile, one type of neighborhood? Is it 2, 3, 4? So it's an iterative process, and then there's a number of decision criteria that you use to try to figure out what seems to be the best representation of what's occurring within the city. And so we followed that framework, and that's how we arrived at 4.
Interesting. We have another question, which may be a little more philosophical or maybe not. Does the place affect gun violence, or does gun violence affect the place as far as vacant housing or segregation? Or are we seeing in Syracuse a vicious cycle where they're just influencing each other on rotation? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think it's, what this is kind of starting to head into is kind of systems level thinking, which we know, the things are recursive, right? And so the answer probably is that they feed on one another, such that, the place creates opportunities for gun violence to occur, but then gun violence also maybe reinforces places, as I was mentioning before, right? So some of these neighborhoods, because they may have a reputation, for being places where gun violence occurs, and maybe they overlap with certain, places where gangs are especially active. You see businesses don't want to build there, or, people don't want to move there. And so, the residents who are there are disproportionately impacted, and they're kind of stuck because it's hard to encourage growth in those places. And then it's also hard to discourage some of the gun violence that emerges from being in a place where maybe there's not a lot of informal social control, and places where there are not a lot of opportunities. So I think it is probably reinforcing one another, those two different things.
We have a question from an elected leader, and I know that these are some of the stakeholders in Syracuse that you've also been speaking with. What are the most effective ways to curb gun violence in that capacity, specifically at the state or local level? In other words, what should offices, governmental offices in these communities or throughout the state be doing right now?
Okay. You want to say anything, Margaret? Do you want me to?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I would say probably, I think investment in, one of the things that we know is again, that very strong relationship with poverty. So the investment in those communities is going to be key. Investment in the people, investment in the education, in those areas, in those neighborhoods is going to be key as well. There's a lot of really good violence prevention programs, particularly firearm violence prevention, but violence prevention programs in general that can be invested in as well. One of the areas that we've seen that has a pretty significant effect on the reduction of gun violence is actually the hospital-based violence intervention programs. And we have sort of the start of that here at SUNY Upstate. But it really hasn't blossomed in the way that it could, in part because we haven't had the resources to really build it into what it could be. So I think investing in those kinds of programs is probably incredibly important. But and then obviously related to our place-based, it's investing in those communities.
Yeah, and so just to add to that, so I think what Margaret also is saying too is it's at least a two-tiered approach where you are working with people who are disproportionately at risk for engaging in firearm violence. That's where the hospital-based, violence interruption program comes into play. But we also need to be engaging with the residents in these places where they're most at risk. So when you drive around Syracuse, just to take an example, a lot of times you'll see activity, land bag activity. So, vacant properties are coming down, and it's great that they're not there anymore. But I think we need to talk to residents and see what would they like to see in those places instead of maybe just being green space. Maybe it's an opportunity to build a park, or maybe there's something else that the residents need that could start to build some of that informal social control, work towards things like, um, pride, neighborhood pride. Sometimes we call it collective self-efficacy. So it's the idea that I take pride in my neighborhood, and I want to make sure it's a good place and that there's good things happening here. I feel connected to my neighbors, trying to improve neighborhood cohesion. So that's the other piece Margaret was saying, where it's engaging with residents and finding out what do you want in these places. How can we, acting on place, how can we um, make sure that the places here are things that residents want and things that will make them feel like the neighborhoods is going a direction that they want it to.
Coming, kind of building off of that, one of the questions from our audience is, in your conversations with community members and those who are living in these communities, have you asked residents to define their own neighborhoods or what place means to them?
It's a great question. So, in terms of our research, we have not collected data from many people. And so we have not done that piece. It's an important piece, and because I think what you see there is it's really hard sometimes to define what a neighborhood is. And when you really drill down to it, it oftentimes comes down to the social connections that people have. You know what I mean? And so maybe I feel like my neighborhood are the three people who live around me, but maybe it's also the people who are across the street or, a couple of streets over who are also people I have a close relationship with. And so that's a tough problem, or it's not a tough problem, but it's not a problem really. It's just a feature of neighborhoods, and that there's this social component to them. And from a public health standpoint, we kind of have to straddle the idea that neighborhoods are both a physical place and they're also a kind of non-tangible place, with the connections that we have with other people. And so it's an important piece. It's one that we have not focused on in our research so far. We've been focused more on trying to understand the place aspect more than the relationships that people use to define what neighborhood means to them.
We got another question, which is actually pretty interesting, thinking about like these sort of hot spots, if you will, about where place and gun violence is intersecting. In the communities that you've investigated, obviously, again, as a reminder, you guys are looking at census block levels, not community in the traditional neighborhood sense. But have you seen a difference in the police presence, whether that is the number of precincts or how close a precinct is, or, is it more regularly patrolled than other areas? What's sort of the relationship with law enforcement that you might have found?
It's a great question. So we haven't looked at that piece and trying to see how policing activity might vary as a function of these neighborhoods. I want to say we have some data we collected that we have not analyzed yet. I don't remember if that's included among it. But it's a great question in terms of trying to understand how police activity may vary. One thing I'll say is, even though we haven't looked at that, one thing that has come from some of the work that's been done in Syracuse specific to police activity is there's a violent crime assessment that the city put together a few years ago, and it spoke a little bit to policing. And one of the things that came from it was that Syracuse, especially around the time that we were looking at, was experiencing a big downturn in terms of the number of officers who were available to go out on patrol, and that a lot of times they were responding to events that were non-gun related, and that because of the kind of that combination of lower numbers of staff, lower numbers of officers, and a high influx of calls, some of those more high impact events like gun violence, they just were not able to respond to them in the way that would be most effective. So that speaks to what I think what we might see if we were to look at that in our data, but it remains to be seen what we'll actually find when we look at that in our data.
We also have another question, kind of, I think, dovetailing, I won't say nicely, off of this. You may not have looked at this just yet, but have you considered the percentage of neighborhood violence that may be attributable to domestic violence, either from domiciled or intimate partners? Because also that may be something that law enforcement, as you were explaining, can't necessarily respond to right away with the limited resources that they have. And so is that something that's also playing into it, independently or in connection with that?
That's a good question. I think so. The data that we have, that's getting more at motive or context of what surrounded the gun violence, and that data is not available. So our data came from two different sources. So we had data that came from the CNY Crime Analysis Center, which is primarily the Syracuse Police Department, and then and also from upstate. So that's how we define those two different outcomes. And an inherent limitation, so there's some great things about that data, but one limitation is that kind of context is not present. Those details aren't there in terms of what was happening around the event. So you'd have to go to a different data source to better understand that. It's tough to do that without, you're really dependent on information that was collected or inferred. So you're looking at maybe like news stories to try to understand what was going on around an event. So that's a tough question to get at from, I think, trying to collect data in that way and to tease out like what was the motivation for a particular gun violence event. What was the context? What led up to it? And oftentimes, if you look at these news stories, they don't include that either because it's just not known. So it's a really good question, a really good piece of a good thing to look into. But I think there's some challenges with actually trying to tease that out.
So I can chime in a little bit related to the upstate data for that. So the data that we obtained from upstate is based on ICD-10 codes. Which do sometimes contain that information. There are specific codes related to intent and specific codes related to sort of the context around it. I can tell you that generally they are not correctly coded because there's the undetermined intent or undetermined context, and that's very often what is used in these codes. For a project using a similar timeline, but it was a different project than the one that Bryce and I are talking about today, I did actually go into some of the charts to review the notes to get a sense of what is the context, what are the circumstances around a lot of these incidents of firearm injuries. And the majority of them were not domestic related if they had information available. But there were quite a few that we could not determine the circumstances around the event.
So we've talked, a fair amount about the community and the residents within them and also the stakeholders who are sort of spearheading these changes. But we haven't talked about another group, which was brought up by one of our audience members. What do you guys think we can do to support the grassroots organizations to make sure that they have the resources to address the root causes of violence, both systemic violence, also firearm-related violence? How do we support their efforts while also being mindful of place?
That's a great question. So one thing I will say is that oftentimes those organizations where they get funding from a variety of places. So sometimes it's state funding, sometimes it's foundational grants from a variety of places. So I think one thing that every person could do is interact with state officials. Send letters to your congressional representatives, highlighting the importance of this issue and of the organizations that are doing the work, right, supporting them. I will say that if you're somebody who is interested in doing this research, if you're in academia or at a nonprofit, or if you're in some capacity interested in doing this research, it's also a great time to partner with community-based organizations because while funding has gotten a lot tougher for a variety of issues related to gun violence, a lot of the things that are out there are focused on very solutions-focused research that would include partnering with a community-based organization and supporting the services that they're doing. So those are two things that jump to mind to me is in trying to find ways, if you are someone who works in this space in a research capacity or in some space like that, it's a great time to be collaborating with community-based organizations to support the work that they're doing. And then if you're outside of that, making sure these issues are top of mind to state and local officials and that these organizations get support that they need. Do you have anything you want to add, Margaret?
I think, I agree with everything that you just said. And I would say just reaching out to those organizations to see what they need. Very often it is resources, but it's also sometimes time and people. And so just reaching out to them, these different grassroots organizations to see what their needs are, what they say would be most helpful to them is important too.
Absolutely. And you guys may have looked at this or may not, but we did get a couple of questions about firearm types. So I do want to pose those to you. Did you happen to look at the differences in types of weapons that were used relative to place, for instance, 3D printed guns versus handguns versus rifles? And also, did your research include accidental firearm violence and whether or not the firearms were secured or unsecured?
So we don't have that level of detail, but what we do know more broadly is that handguns tend to be the weapons that are most often involved in these types of crime. And it's oftentimes illegal firearms that travel from states where maybe there's less laws in place around background checks and other laws that kind of prevent illegal guns from being distributed. So we don't have that level of detail, but my understanding and some of the other things that I've read and some of the other research I've done in the city suggests that pattern, which exists on a broader scale in the U.S., is similar to what we see in Syracuse. I don't know about the 3D printed gun. It's a really interesting question. One thing that I have to imagine that might be difficult to obtain for some people. I mean, I think 3D printers they're not widely accessible. So I think it might be tough for those to be a major source of what's contributing to what's happening. I think that illegal handguns that are crossing state lines are more oftentimes what's involved in these different episodes.
Yeah, and the 3D printed handguns are also incredibly difficult to track. That's by design, and so we definitely don't have that data available to us. I'm sure there are other people. I don't know whether or not they're working on it specifically in the Syracuse area, but there are definitely other people working in that space around gun violence as well.
And just because everybody set us up so perfectly, we do actually have a brief on ghost guns, not necessarily 3D printed, but unserialized firearms. That does include data from the New York State Police, which is available on our website. We are running out of time, and unfortunately, we got more questions than we have minutes in the hour. So a couple of things before I pose the final question to you all. First of all, if your question was not answered during the session, we do apologize. Please feel free to send that to us in an email or through our contact form on the website, and we will connect you with Bryce and Margaret to get you that answer. But, obviously you guys have done a tremendous amount of work, but there's still so much more work to be done. So I wanted to just, as the final question for today, is to ask you what's next. What are you thinking about next, and where do you see your work going?
That's a great question. So I think there's a few different ways that we are thinking about this work. So I think most immediately, we're trying to understand that non-resident pattern that I described. And so we're broadening some of the place-based features you've been examining to look at things like gang territory, commercial establishments, transit stops, and to see if those help explain that pattern. So that's something that is kind of more proximate. As I think I mentioned earlier, our plans are also to continue monitoring these place-based features as the I-81 project continues to unroll down the road so that we can start seeing how changes in the city might correspond to changes in these different types of neighborhoods and how that in turn relates to gun violence. And then I think another area that I'm interested in and thinking about is how Syracuse compares to other places, even in New York State. So, we are looking into collecting similar data in places like Rochester or Buffalo so we can see how these different cities compare to one another. I would expect differences. They're different places with different histories. So even though these features may create different types of neighborhoods, the way that those features relate to one another may vary from place to place, which may in turn relate to different patterns of gun violence. And so where you see differences, that oftentimes gives you a clue about what are you really making accurate generalizations if we were just focusing on Syracuse. Maybe it would be better to look at these other places to really understand, what's going on in each place, and then in turn can that help inform maybe more broader guidelines about how we can change place to shape gun violence and decrease it. Do you have anything else you wanted to add, Margaret?
Yeah, I think, I agree with everything you just said about how we can move forward with these, with our work. And I think one of the nice aspects that we have with our data is that long timeline of data that we really haven't tapped into yet. And so I think sort of capitalizing on that going forward is important. There are a lot of revitalization projects. I know Bryce, you mentioned the land bank, and there's been a lot of revitalization in specific neighborhoods in Syracuse that I think it would be really relatively easy, because we have the data already, to go back and look to see what aspects of those revitalization efforts have had a positive or negative impact on gun violence in Syracuse. So I think looking to that, I think also bringing in those aspects, those social aspects of place going forward will be important into that latent class analysis. And then I know for me personally, I almost would like to go back to where I started with those pockets of neighborhoods that seem to have that level of protection against gun violence, those highly impoverished neighborhoods that had lower levels of gun violence, and see, now that we have the expanded timeline of data, do those pockets still exist? Did they change over time? And, really dive into them to get a better sense of why they seem to have that level of protection, and can we use that information moving forward as we rebuild these neighborhoods?
Well, certainly a long road ahead, no pun intended, for however I-81 is now going to go around the city. But thank you guys both for taking time out of your day to share your research and this really important lens with us and our audience. Thank you to all of our audience members as well for joining us today and taking time out of your day to learn more about Bryce and Margaret's important research. As mentioned at the top of the event, we will be placing the recording on our website, so you will be able to watch the playback. Again, please feel free to reach out via our contact form on our website with any follow-up questions. We'll be happy to connect you with Bryce and Margaret. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks again for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.